Hello, I'm John Powell. Our oral history session this time is with former governor and former state senator Martin Schreiber. And thanks very much for joining us.
John, good to be here. Thank you very much.
And well, let's start at the beginning. Now, you were born into a political family.
Born at an early age, and yes, into a political family. My dad was first elected in 1942 when I was about 4 years of age, and everything that I wanted to do after watching my dad was to serve in government. And he ran for the assembly and was elected in 42 as a progressive Republican. Then in 44 was elected alderman of the city of Milwaukee and served until 1976. Ran for state senate in 1962. Ran against Fred Kessler in the Democratic primary. Won by 256 votes. 200 of those votes thinking my dad had done such a great job that he should be elevated to Madison. And 56 of those votes, people thinking my dad should be sent to Madison because they didn't like the job that he did. So much of my political career certainly is an embodiment of my family life and my dad's profession.
He was also Martin Schreiber.
That's correct. He was Martin E. I was Martin J. And we didn't do too much of a great effort to try and have that distinguished in the minds of the people going back there in 1962.
Which is one of the reasons you became the youngest elected state senator.
Well, that's what they tell me, but I never really checked it out because I sort of felt it was bad luck. But now as I talk with my grandchildren, I resurrect that, and I hope that I'm correct.
So what was, your father was a Republican, now you were...
Well, progressive Republican,
okay.
Yes. And what happened was by 1962, from of course, 44, the whole situation had changed relative to people's outlook, and also early 60s, for example, very significant industrial workforce, particularly in the near inner city of Milwaukee, which is the area that I represented. And so, you look and you make decisions, and sort of felt that the Democratic Party would have been and was the best way for me to represent the people of that district.
And your dad, too, was in the Democratic primary by that time.
Yes. Well, as city alderman, he ran in a nonpartisan kind of race. But what brought me into this race at such an early age, in 1962, Gaylord Nelson at the time had to raise more money, and then had to raise a sales tax. And he needed to pass his sales tax legislation through the state senate. And he was 1 vote short. And amazingly, there was a state senator by the name of Bill Mosier, a Democrat, from the district that I ran in. And lo and behold, he supported the sales tax. And when the vacancy occurred in the judiciary, Gaylord Nelson looked around and he says, who is the most intelligent person around? And lo and behold, it happened to be Bill Mosier, because of his Gaylord Nelson's affirmation about Bill Mosier's decision making. And so Bill Mosier was appointed a judge. There was a vacancy, and that brought Fred Kessler and I together in that race. As a side note, Fred Kessler and I went through the same high school. We're in the same high school class. And he is now, as of this moment in time, also serving in the Wisconsin legislature.
He's definitely someone we want to get in the future, but as you say, now he's back in the legislature. He's been in and out. And
yes, well, it is of curiosity to me whether or not, if I would come back into elected office, whether or not I would still be part of legislative history. And maybe I'll just stay out of it for the sole intent of being able to visit with you.
Okay. Well, to tell us what Milwaukee politics and Wisconsin politics were like in the 40s and 50s.
Well, in the 40s, I was somewhere around, born in 39, so in the 40s and 50s, I wasn't, really dramatically involved. I can remember clearly the election of Hubert Humphrey and Jack Kennedy in that primary back in 1960. I can remember being inspired by Jack Kennedy and all of the ideals and the principles that he held and tried to make sure that the American people shared with him. So that I can recall very specifically, and of course meeting Hubert Humphrey and getting a sense of him and his passion. All of those had an inspiring influence on what I wanted to do, and also an inspiring influence of my ambition to serve in public life. As I said, from as long as I can remember, I wanted to serve as governor of the state of Wisconsin. In fact, I remember praying that I would be governor of Wisconsin, and I was, and if I could do it over again, instead of just praying to be governor of Wisconsin, I would pray for 4 4-year terms. I didn't do that.
It didn't get reelected. People may not realize that Milwaukee politics is a little different. Being a Milwaukee member of the city council is a pretty big deal.
Well, yes, it is, and was you know, at that time, and I think played a contributing role into helping the Schreiber name be identified with good government. And again, I owe that to my dad. Another challenging aspect of Milwaukee politics is the fact that in some instances, representatives from Milwaukee or candidates from Milwaukee for statewide office are looked upon as not in good favor by the rest of the state. Some people from outstate look at Milwaukee as an entity unto itself, a problem, and therefore would maybe be inclined, on balance, to vote for someone from outstate rather than from someone from the city of Milwaukee. And try as we might to have people understand we are really part of Wisconsin and part of what makes the economy strong. Some people just simply feel uncomfortable with that.
We'll get to more of this on your race for governor later, but do you think that hurt you, being from Milwaukee?
Well, I'd like to claim any excuse that I could. I don't think that hurt as much as the major issue. At that time, going back to 1978, we had a projected $1 billion surplus. I wanted to save the money, invest it, make sure it's set aside for a rainy day, and Lee Dreyfus, articulate, and well, it was his campaign stance that money should be given back to the people, and I mean that was the discussion, and on that the clear majority decided that he should serve as governor, and they in turn got the money back. And I look back and I say, wow, I said, that's something. Now look at the billions of dollars of deficits that we have. And so, if nothing else, that was you know, sometimes a person in public life has to make a decision that they recognize they're going to have to live with, live or die. And I asked myself the question in front of the mirror, and the question was, am I willing to go down and defeat, you know, with the belief that we should be investing that surplus? And I was. I just felt that was such a vital part of what we are as Wisconsinites, and that is to be frugal, to make investments, and to make sure that we are prepared to meet whatever the challenge might be in the future. And so I don't blame people for wanting to think that they should get back what they gave, but my thought on that was a little bit different, and so be it.
We'll get back to that. I'm getting a little out of the chronology here. We're still back in Milwaukee in the 50s, I think.
Well, I'll join you.
So you must have had a lot of political conversation at the dinner table and things like
I tell you, that was terrific. At that time, you know, many families had supper, which was the evening meal, and we had breakfast together. And when school was not in session, of course, lunch. And my dad would come home from the office after, down back from City Hall, and always there was a discussion of what was going on, what was happening, the various issues, the labor issues, for example, the tax issues, and many times he would also take me along with him down to the city council chambers, and I watched what was going on and sort of got a sense and a feel, and I said, this is something that I think I want to do.
Was it a full-time job, Alderman?
It was a full-time job at the time, yes.
Yes. We'll show it on the video. You have your father's campaign poster from 1942.
Going back to 1942, and as I see it now, he was in favor of people having jobs, of making sure that the youngsters were protected and not involved in juvenile delinquency. He wanted to make sure that the senior citizens were taken care of and that taxes were low. And so Well, if he would have done a perfect job, we wouldn't have all these issues today.
No, but people are running on exactly that today, right?
It doesn't change, I guess.
No, but they weren't taken care of then. What were the issues in Milwaukee and Wisconsin at that time?
Well, one of the issues that really stands out was the strike at Kohler, Wisconsin. And I say it stands out because my parents would go to a small community in Sheboygan County, and I think this would go back into the late 40s, early 50s. And I would hear the friends that I would have made, my contemporaries, maybe 13, 14 years of age, and someone would call the other a scab, someone would beat up another person of their age, as youngsters and so on, and I really couldn't quite understand it. And then at the time, my dad, as the president of the city council, had to make a decision in the mayor's absence, and the question was, should there be a ship docking in Milwaukee that had the clay to make the bathtubs and so forth at Kohler. And I can remember his discussions around the dinner table. I can remember that whole driving by the Kohler plant and seeing the National Guard with their machine guns on top of the buildings for alleged, I guess, protection from the strikers. But that clearly stands out. And then also at the time, what they called urban redevelopment. And you take the Marine Bank now down on Wisconsin Avenue in Water, which is quite along in years, but that was built under an urban redevelopment program with a tax freeze, and that was one of the first new buildings in Milwaukee going back to that era, probably after the war. And of course, if you look at what happened to the old Marine Bank, which no longer is, and understanding that that facility is now in its grandfather years, the thought then comes back that the matter of how we try and save our cities as the attraction of people who are seeking opportunity, and that urban redevelopment was considered, certainly one of the programs. On the grassroots level, sometimes I would stay home to take care of my brother while my parents would go shopping, and my responsibility was to answer the phone. And seldom, if ever, was there no one home from 8 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night, because the important point was for there to be someone to answer the phone. And so someone would call and you would say 2200, which was the number, and someone at the other end would say, our ashes haven't been collected now for 10 days and someone's got to take care of it, or the dog next door is barking too loud, or when the cars go over the manhole cover, it clicks and it keeps me awake at night. And so all of those grassroots kinds of experiences help me understand fully that whether you're talking about $1 billion surplus or whether you're talking about the service of a government to an individual homeowner or renter, the fact of the matter is the government covers the whole gamut, whether it's a clanking manhole cover keeping someone awake, or whether or not we invest for the future and take that $1 billion and use it to help make things better.
So you took all those messages.
Well, I didn't take every single one of them, but I sure took enough of them, and it did give me a sense. And then also what would happen, and again, this is just part of the building of the character, but when my dad would come home after dinner, he would have a list of 4 or 5 people that wanted to see him. So we would get in the car and we would, on the way there, talk about what he is going to see this person about. Many times he would take me in and I would sit and listen while the person would be either praising or condemning what was going on, and you just pick up not only through osmosis but also a bit of sensitivity and understanding about the passion and the feelings and the experience of people as they are trying to get through their own life, much less try and deal with what government is doing either for or against them.
Some people may not realize, we see the headlines and the news stories, of course, about legislation, but constituent service is so important. Those barking dogs and manhole covers and everything, that's a big part of the job.
Well, as you and I know, whether you're serving in the United States Senate or whether you're serving as an alderman or a school board member, people want to feel close to their government. And generally, if you look at the polls and have personal experience, you'll see that people are willing to condemn, other elected officials except their own elected official, who generally they believe is of integrity and doing their best. And I think it's that constituent service. Now, I have seen, and probably you have too, where constituent service has been excellent, but the voting and the political philosophy and whatever that person might want to be doing in a public nature. I mean, we talked a little bit before the cameras went on about Joe McCarthy. Well, Joe McCarthy could have great constituent service, but by the same token, that's just it's an important part of being reelected, but certainly an insignificant part of taking a nation or a state and having it move forward in a direction which builds a stronger tomorrow for our young people.
So you'd had politics in mind from the cradle, practically.
Well, that's a fact. And my dad tells the story, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but maybe you can help me interpret it. But he said that when I have a brother and a sister who's older, when my sister was born and just a toddler, 2 or 3 years old, he would set her on the floor and with a book and with an apple and with some money. And if you would grab the book, you would be a teacher. And if you would grab the apple, you would be a farmer. And if you would grab the money, you would be a banker. And so my sister grabbed the book and was a teacher. And then I came along, and my dad set me down, and he said I grabbed all 3 of them. And at that point, then, that determined my career. I think that's a story, though, that's made up.
So did you, obviously you were tutored by your father, almost by osmosis, as you said. Did you make any other specific preparations for a life in public service?
I wanted to have a law degree because I wanted something to fall back on, and I never wanted to be in a position of public life where I had to make a decision to save my job more so than doing what I thought was right for the people I represented. And so I did go on to law school, and I did graduate. I would want to say that my responsibility in law school was to make sure that there was an upper half level in the class, and I fulfilled that very respectfully. But I did get my law degree, and I then was in a position to make a decision, right or wrong, but I was able to make it with knowing that I didn't have to take a direction which only would save my job but not be the proper one as I would recommend it for the state to follow.
And it was about that time you first ran for the state senate.
That's correct. Going back to 19...
Was this after you graduated?
Well, no. I was a junior in law school, and I was elected in 1962, and I graduated from law school in 1964. And I was not yet with enough experience in the state senate to pass a law which would have forbidden Marquette University Law School from disclosing my grades. And they, of course, never did, but I thought that would have been a good thing to do.
But you graduated.
I graduated. And
while serving in the legislature.
While serving in the legislature. By the way, the salary at the time that I was elected was $300 a month. And surprisingly enough, you could barely squeak by on that. And at that time, we had 2 children, Elaine and I, and that $300 a month was a pretty important factor. And I think $25 a day expense money. And if you would go to the old Belmont Hotel, which is now the YWCA in Madison, right across from the Capitol, for $5.25 an evening, you could get a room by yourself, but you have to share a bathroom. And so it was the Belmont Hotel that I spent a lot of nights at.
Now, this was before. Today, law schools and, well, many schools have all sorts of programs for adult returning education, and you can get things online. They didn't have that back then. It was not easy going to school and legislating at the same time, was it?
No. My senior year, I finished in a course of 2 years. And so also in that era, you did not have what you would call today a full-time legislature. As I recollect, there was 1 secretary for every 5 senators, and Now, of course, it's completely flipped, where it's 5 assistants almost for every legislator. But things were a lot different. You were generally in session 2 days a week, and by the time the budget was supposed to have been passed as of June 30th, everything was pretty much wrapped up, and then the rest of the time was not filled with the type of special sessions that you and I are seeing right now. And the legislative work was then pretty well done by June 30th.
Well, during your time, you saw pretty much the completion of the full-time legislature. Was that a good idea to go to a full-time legislature?
Well, I think those legislators that are serving full-time would say, yeah, it's a great idea. That's a tough one to answer, because you can make as many arguments for one side as for another. However, I will make an observation, and that is going back into the 60s. My colleagues were farmers, insurance agents, grocers, attorneys, accountants, and so forth, and so they were in the legislature part-time, and collegiality was easy to come by, because again, no one was in that position for blood, for either the furtherance of their career, nor were they in that position to get at or get even with someone else. And the end game was, what kind of decision can we make that's going to be in the best interest of the state? Now, some may argue that that's what's going on right now, but some people may have the perception that that's not what is going on, that it's more important to beat the opponent, beat the other party, than it is to try and get a resolve to some of these issues. And therefore, some legislators may be sitting on their hands, or may be attempting to do what they can to undercut and undermine the career of another legislator. And I don't remember that kind of strength of passion to destroy the opposition as I sense now. I met with a man yesterday, and he said, well, he said, you know, you may have a point, but if you go back to Jefferson and Adams, and he said they had duels at that time, didn't they? And I said, well, are you asking me because you think I lived through that era, or are you asking me because that was a refreshment of history? And he said, well, the latter. And I said, well, you are right. And you and I do go back and look at early American history, and there were some vicious things that happened. And so whether or not we just go through cycles of collegiality and people working together and then pulling apart and then maybe coming back together again, I hope so. I hope we get to the point where you know, we only solve things if we agree that we want to try and solve them together.
So in the Senate, you worked with people from the other party, from other parts of the state?
Oh, sure. Well, when I came in, there were, of the 33 senators, there were 9 Democrats. And so you had no option but to try and work with the rest of the Republicans. And they, for the most part, were always gracious and kind and respectful, and was able to make some progress. I can recall at the time we had some significant educational problems in Milwaukee, and I invited the Education Committee to Milwaukee to tour some of our schools. And so these were 3 Republican legislators who gave of their time to come to Milwaukee, and it was a great experience, not only for them but also for me. And we did end up being successful in getting some additional resources to be brought to bear on the problem. And again, without the willingness to try and understand, you know, they could have said, no, we don't have time, and the educational system at that time could have languished even to a more significant degree, but we were able to get it done. Now, you know, again, if we look at the educational system, that wasn't the cure to end all.
So the turbulent 1960s, you mentioned the Kennedy phenomenon being partly responsible for bringing you into public service. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we had all of the horrible events, the Kennedys and Martin Luther King and the war and the civil rights. It was a tumultuous time.
I can recall specifically when Father Grappi, who was then a Catholic priest and a leader of the civil rights movement, or considered to be the leader of the civil rights movement, marched to Madison, and with over 1,000 people, took over the assembly chambers, just marched in and took over the seats. And I can recall that they had baskets that they had a long rope that they would put out of the second floor story window and send down the baskets. They would put in food and bring up the food and so forth because the National Guard was called out. And a couple of things that stand out really at that moment in time. And that was that Warren Knowles, as governor, exercised supreme judgment and patience. And he could have, you know, marched in there with the National Guard and tear gas, and it could have been a horrendous experience, but it was not. It ended up in a peaceful resolve with no one getting hurt. So I remember that and always have respected and admired Warren Knowles for that, regardless of anything else I thought he may have done which wasn't along my political thinking. But the other point that I remember very succinctly, when the people were in the assembly and had taken that over, I walked over to talk with some of them. And while I was talking, this one young woman looked at me, and well, she said, "Senator Schreiber, how are you?" And I looked at her and I said, oh, she says, "Well, I'm so-and-so. I was your babysitter, you know, for my children." And I said, "Well, my goodness, that's right. I do recognize you now." I said, "What are you doing here?" Well, she said, "I look at this war and I looked at what's going on relative to people's rights." And she said, "I didn't know what to do. I felt I had to do something, so here I am." And there again, just a key lesson and understanding of how people, when feeling frustrated and restricted and embodied by some kind of a force, are searching for a way to express their concerns and searching for a way to get out of the challenge of the situation. And everyone has their own resolve and their own answer, and it's amazing, I guess, that our system works as well as it does, but it does. Somehow or another it does.
That was a tremendous time of change through the 1960s. If you contrast when you entered the Senate to the 1970s.
You know, I remember, you know, the powerful impressions about the 60s with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and also, you know, Lyndon Johnson and Bob Kastenmeier, for example, a congressman from the Dane County area, was a person who I respected, and he told me he had met with Lyndon Johnson, and he said, Kastenmeier said, that Lyndon told him that he was not going to be the first American president to lose a war. And he said it greatly troubled him, and also it greatly troubled me, that the idea of not losing the war as the first American president seemed to take precedent over whether or not that war was something that we should have been involved in the first place. And also what comes to mind is the courage of Pat Lucey at that point, being willing to speak out and take on that issue. We got into the 70s. In 1970, there was a race for governor, Pat Lucey as governor and Marty Schreiber as lieutenant governor. And I can recall a number of times on the campaign trail where people would say, "Well, why in the world are you talking about Vietnam? Why, you know, that's not a national issue." And I can also recall shaking hands at a number of different firemen's picnics around the state where more than one mother would come up to me in tears and say, "Why does this war have to go on when my son has either been killed or injured or is over there?" And so that whole, maybe the 60s, and you know, you look at Hubert Humphrey's convention and the situation in Chicago, maybe that was just an abhorrent growing up experience for this country where we would have maybe learned some things. But as I say that, we're at war in Afghanistan and we're over there still in Iraq, and so I don't know if we ever learn.
Some highlights of your Senate career? Well, we might as well get it over with. I'll ask you about the famous taste test between butter and oleomargarine.
Well, that was a sort of fun thing. First of all, as a youngster, and maybe I was 24, 25-year-old at the time, representing the city of Milwaukee, my neighbors and friends would have to go to Chicago to buy oleo that was colored. And you could buy oleo here, but it had a 15-cent per pound tax. and it came white as lard, and you had to take your own food coloring and then color it up. And so I felt that that was not right. And why cannot we buy oleo that's colored? And of course, the dairy industry wanted to protect the sale of the butter. Well, there was a colleague of mine by the name of Senator Gordon Roslip, just a true quality person, and he believed that we should never allow the sale of colored oleo in the state of Wisconsin, much less take off the tax.
Now, he's a Republican representing Darlington, a
Yes,
very rural district.
that's a very important point. So in addition to being a quality fellow, he was a little boisterous. And so I thought, well, what I would do is I would see if I couldn't set up a test on oleo, and I would have unmarked trays. One was with butter, one was with colored oleo, another one with Dine, which was a combination dairy spread from the University of Wisconsin. And I would have people test it and then mark down what they thought was butter bread. Well, Senator Roslip said, he says, I can tell you the difference. And I said, well, will you take it blindfolded? And he said, yeah. He said, I'll take it blindfolded. And he said, not only, but in a great, boisterous voice, looking around like he knew. And of course, I gave him the test, and he promptly labeled, the oleo as butter. And that picture of me giving him that cracker with that oleo on it was transported throughout the United States, and I think made every single major newspaper in the country. And gosh, I hope that I hope that is not my only claim to fame when I go to the great capital in the sky. But it was an interesting experience, and as was pointed out at a later point, his daughter actually served him colored oleo because he had heart problems, and she wanted to protect him from the cholesterol, and whether or not that was a better push for the sale of butter, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, it was quite an experience, and in a period of time, we passed a law which did away with the tax, and now you can go buy colored oleo any place you want in Wisconsin.
So the blindfold part was his idea.
Well, maybe a combination. Yeah, it was he was so self-assured. And I can remember Senator Dempsey, who was the head of the Ag Committee. I asked him if he wanted to take the test, and he was pretty smart. And he said, no, he says, that's all right. He said, we'll do it another time.
Well, you don't want that to be your only legacy of the state senate. What else was big in the state senate at the time?
Well, as I mentioned, we went through what they called the riots in Milwaukee, and talked about the improvement of the school system. And I think those, were probably the highlighted issues of the time, because of the impact on people's lives, and also the challenge in making sure that people had equal opportunity. Open housing legislation, the fact that at the period of time in the early 60s, you could refuse to rent or to sell a home to a person of color. And highly discriminatory, and there was a movement, and this was one of the reasons for Father Grappe's march, but there was certainly a movement to try and end discrimination in housing, and we ended up doing that, but it was very alien. You look at what's going on now with the thought about the burning of the Koran, and also the mosque in New York near disaster of the Twin Towers, and for some reason we as a people sometimes seek to hang on to those fears and those prejudices and don't shred them as quickly as we could or should. But eventually, as I said, that legislation passed. We now hope we can have people obtain accommodations regardless of race, color, or creed, and we go on from there. But it seems we always have to relearn that message and that story.
Government alone doesn't seem to be enough, though. Milwaukee is still de facto highly segregated in its housing, even though the legal redlining and so forth is no longer legal.
Well, a number of factors for that, and one would hope that there is an opportunity for people to move around and about, but there have been some insurance companies that have been called appropriately to task for redlining districts, for example, and some of these housing programs have gone out of their way to try and give people a greater opportunity. So it's a continuous battle. You know, one would think that once you roll the rock up the hill, the Greek gods would let it stay there, but myth of Sisyphus requires you to roll it back up again and keep on rolling.
Yep, fighting the same battle, really.
Yes.
Not in the same legal sense, but the same overall effect that you're still dealing with.
Yes.
Well, are we up to the 1970 election? Tell us about
Well,
that.
if you want to be, that was sort of fun. It goes back to Pat Lucy and I ran against Warren Knowles and Jack Olson. And at that time, Pat Lucy and I were, you know, we're traveling the state, and it was a good balance with his residence being in Dane County and my residence being in Milwaukee. And at that period of time, the salary of a lieutenant governor was $7,500 a year. But Pat Lucy was gracious to me and helped me make the role of lieutenant governor a role that was meaningful. And during that period of time, we did some research and investigation into nursing homes and the nursing homes treatment of elderly citizens. And we found out any number of very serious things, not the least of which was, you know, some doctors were able to examine 20 patients within an hour. Some doctors were so proficient in caring about their patient that notwithstanding the patient had died, they kept on rendering and charging for medical treatment. Unanswered bed bells, only giving people an opportunity to play bingo all day long if they were lucky. And we attempted to change the care and treatment of people in nursing homes and also develop alternatives to nursing home care. And because of the Medicaid, Medicare program going back into the 70s, people thought it was just a natural process to go from their home into a nursing home. And we began, I think, as a society to think of these nursing homes as nothing more than warehouses for the elderly. And it just was not right. And so we then did develop what was called the Community Care Organization. And to the chagrin of many Republicans, particularly in the Nixon administration, I was successful in getting a grant from the Nixon administration to establish and to set up community care organizations, a certain number of them as pilot projects throughout the state of Wisconsin. And those experiments proved to be effective, and you wouldn't think you'd have to experiment with anything like that. You just have to think about it, and common sense would dictate that sitting in a nursing home 24 hours a day is not the answer to a quality life or to effective use of taxpayers' dollars. So as I look back on my career as in public service, forget about the oleo, but the whole focus on how can we most effectively preserve the dignity of senior citizens, how can we most effectively and efficiently and economically provide care. I would like to think that I played a role in getting us in a better direction.
Now, 1970 was the first election where the governor and lieutenant governor ran as a ticket?
That's correct,
yeah.
And for a 4-year term.
Yeah, so Pat Lucy and yours were the first 4-year terms for
yes.
governor and lieutenant, and the first to run as a ticket.
That's correct.
Prior to that, younger people may not realize that you could have had a governor of one party and a lieutenant governor of the other party, which did happen.
Yes, it did.
So that was a good change then, to have the governor and the lieutenant governor as a team?
Well, one would think so. And of course, Pat Lucy, as I said, was gracious and gave me an opportunity to have that office be useful. But as we look at some of the experiences since that time, you have had governor and lieutenant governor of the same party, and maybe they did not get along as good as they would have gotten along had they been of different parties. But I think the theory is on target, and that is when people elect a governor, they are in essence also electing someone that, should there be a tragedy and should something happen to the governor, that there should be a continuity of philosophy that they voted for in that previous election. And so theoretically, I think it's correct on target. Practically speaking, it always doesn't work out that way. And it used to be that the law would state that when the governor would leave the state of Wisconsin, then at that point the lieutenant governor shall become the acting governor. Well, some circumstances where a governor would sooner be boiled in oil than to leave the state and leave their lieutenant governor in charge of whatever was going on. Now, I hope Pat Lucy never felt that way, but I know that there were situations where they finally worked for a change in the law where the governor continued to be governor regardless of his
That's
location.
been changed now, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously that goes back to pre-modern communications, that when the governor was out of the state,
That's correct.
the lieutenant governor would effectively take over. One of those cases went to the state Supreme Court, I believe, that somebody had acted, and the question was whether the other person was in the state or out of the state. So that's been cleaned up. That's,
Yes, it has been cleaned up.
But the lieutenant governor, like the vice president, his only or her only job is what the president or the governor lets you do or gives you to do.
Yes, and again, Pat Lucy was helpful to me in turning over to me the enthusiasm and his concern for the treatment of elderly people in nursing homes that then allowed the state agencies and state departments to become fully supportive and energized in helping get us off in the direction that we think is going to make a difference.
Let me ask you about constitutional officers. Right now, one of the candidates, at least for state treasurer, running right now as we speak, wants to abolish the job. That's his platform. Should the lieutenant governor and these other offices have constitutional powers, or should they be used better, do you think? Or?
Well, certainly everything can be used better. You know, I think the purposes of electing a Secretary of State and a State Treasurer, I don't know what meaningful purpose there is in that anymore, because most of their powers have been stripped away and most of their responsibility is basically bureaucratic. And so in that regard, then you could argue that we don't need any election for that. But by the same token, you could get some theorists who say, look, you need a training ground, you need an opportunity for some people to bring another dimension of understanding of state issues into the mix. But I'm going to sort of bet that a Secretary of State and a State Treasurer have very seldom been asked for advice and counsel by really anybody, whether it's the legislature or the governor. Attorney General, of course, should continue to be elected.
But you obviously would advocate for better use of the lieutenant governor's office.
There's, as you stated before, the relationship of the governor and the lieutenant governor determine the quality and the depth of involvement of the lieutenant governor. And if there is a feeling of mutual confidence and respect, a lieutenant governor can help the governor in untold ways. If there is distrust, yeah, then you know it's going to be very difficult for any governor to want to turn over responsibilities to someone that they don't feel very comfortable with.
But the governor can't handpick the lieutenant governor candidate, as the president can basically pick his vice presidential running mate. The governor doesn't pick the lieutenant governor. Lieutenant governor runs separately in a primary.
That's correct.
To become the lieutenant governor.
So you could
the two may not have any relationship prior to the...
You could have the same shotgun marriage under your scenario as you had previously, where you could have a governor of one party and a lieutenant governor of another party. And yes, that has happened at times, and people sort of have to muddle through it. And some people are able to do it more successfully than others.
So your term as lieutenant governor, what people looking back on that, what should people remember of the 70s and your...
Well, as I mentioned, certainly the whole issue of nursing homes, and we did a lot of work in the area of consumer protection and trying to make sure that the amount of quality, something as simple as the amount of octane at the gasoline pump is properly stated. Making sure, for example, you can feel relatively secure that when you take your car to be repaired at garage X, Y, and Z, that there is going to be some integrity between, you know, I don't know how far I got on that one, but some integrity between what is wrong in one garage versus what it costs to be fixed at another garage, which may not have anything wrong with it at the third garage. So we did attempt to make sure that the consumer had a louder voice. And also at the same time, I had an opportunity to preside over the Senate. And that was an experience in which I would have almost a direct role, much to the chagrin of the Senate, that someone elected in a different environment would have a deciding vote, would have the ability to refer bills to committee and thereby pronounce them alive or dead. In that presiding of the Senate, I think, gave me an even keener insight into the challenges of legislating and making sure that the work gets done and the work gets done on time.
How so?
Well, you're sort of like to a certain degree, you always have your political philosophy, but to a certain degree, you're like an umpire. And Senator Ernie Kepler, who was the Republican leader at the time with the majority, needed and wanted to get certain pieces of legislation through as a matter of his responsibility, and the Democrats would be watching, and you would see them sometimes. Sometimes you would see some political parties taking positions and attitudes that one would question whether or not would be in the best interest of providing an improvement in the quality of government or trying to stop the opposition from getting what they wanted. And you had a chance to sort of identify from the podium which legislators had the ability and the character and the integrity and the chemistry to work with their colleagues from across the aisle to look at a problem and to jointly solve it. And again, one could perceive that that is not happening as much today as what it may have happened in the past.
So you can see why the majority, it's been changed since. Now the lieutenant governor no longer presides over the Senate. Of course,
Right,
it's
they
been
got
changed
him
by,
out of there.
by constitutional amendment. But it must have been kind of tricky when you're a Democrat and the Republicans are in a majority. You have to work with the Republican majority leader. So how did that worked out well enough?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, now if Senator Kepler would be alive and you would be questioning him, he would tell you about days of frustration where maybe he thought I was too quick on the gavel, or maybe he thought I recognized one speaker ahead of another, which helped affect the direction of the debate. And maybe at times I did make an error or two in, who should or shouldn't be recognized, but on balance, tried to do the best. I can recall that we had a great challenge, and that was the elimination of the 1-week waiting period for unemployment. And this was something that working men and women drastically wanted, because if you were laid off, of course, you had to go through the waiting period, and the Democrats had legislation that would have eliminated that. Well, I was in the chair, and through a series of parliamentary maneuvers, we were able to get that bill eliminating the waiting period, able to get that bill passed into law. And I guess those on the other side could have said that they had their own presiding officer in the chair, that the parliamentary maneuvers could not have been maneuvered.
Ultimately, they needed a majority, though, and obviously the Republicans got one for that bill.
Well, there was a majority that ended up in passage of it, and they, through a matter of rules and arguments that 2/3 vote was required under some circumstances, there was a situation where they did require a 2/3 vote, and someone raised the point of order that it does not require a 2/3 vote, and I said it does not require a 2/3 vote, and then they put the matter to the House, to the body, and it was the body by majority vote who decided whether or not the ruling of the chair would stand. And so you took a 2/3 vote by the raising of a point of order, transferred that 2/3 vote into a majority vote. and maybe a little bit confusing to the voter, but the fact of the matter is sometimes you can get what you want to get even if you don't have it.
So even though the Republicans were in a majority, you got a majority for supporting your ruling.
Well, we got a majority for supporting the ruling, right, but we would have never gotten 2/3 to get the bill where we wanted it to go.
So this is one of those cases where the vote on the ruling was really the vote on the bill. I mean,
Correct.
if the vote on the ruling had gone against you, the bill would have been dead.
That's a fact.
Yeah, so this is kind of hard sometimes for people to follow.
Well, don't they say that watching legislation in session is watching like sausage being made, and to the person, to the casual observer, I think it's just could be at times disgusting and frustrating.
Should we try to do something about that, or?
I don't think you can. I think that I think that as long as there is fight in someone, they will look for every possible, appropriate, legal ways of doing something within the framework of their conscience.
So, the campaign of 1970. Let's move up to that. And first of all, you decided to run with Pat Lucey. Was that a tough decision?
No, it was sort of an easy decision because I always, as I may have said before, that I always wanted to be governor. And I did not have financial resources, and I determined that the best way for me to get there, if I was going to become governor, would be to run for lieutenant governor and to establish not only the experience, but also the reputation of being someone who knew state government and could make state government run.
So this was your second run for lieutenant governor.
Yes.
And your state senate term allowed you to run without giving up the state senate.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I was born under a special star, which allowed me to do that without risking my political
We should
career.
make that point, that half of the state senate, which is not up in the same years as the governor and lieutenant governor, get a free shot sometimes.
That's correct. And it has happened on any number of occasions. And if you look at history, the state senate has been, for want of a better term, a breeding ground. Gaylord Nelson, Henry Meyer, Russ Feingold, John Norquist. Many people have come out of the Senate, and a lot of them through that staggered term process.
Now, did you have to run in a primary to be the governor?
I ran in the primary in 1966 and was successful. And also there was a primary in 1970, but no primary in 1974.
No primary in 70. There was a primary in 70, though.
Yes.
So you had to win that first.
That's correct.
That's a little different, campaigning for a primary than for the general election and for an office that's not at the top of the ticket. How do you go about campaigning for lieutenant governor?
A lot of shoe leather, and not too many people are enthusiastic about making significant contributions to a lieutenant governor because of the question of the degree of impact they would have. And so it's a lot of shoe leather, a lot of traveling the state, shaking hands at cornrows, county fairs, and so on. But then again, in the course of my Senate career, I was willing to travel the state and to try and promote an understanding of the areas of my interest, whether it would be nursing homes or education. And the race for lieutenant governor did not just take place in 1966, but began to take place early in 1963 as I started working in the Senate and tried to develop the kind of support necessary for the passage of the bills I was interested in.
Now, in 1970, did you and Lucy win big?
We like to think we won big. That was against Jack Olson at the time. And I, for better or for worse, I don't look at the percentage of votes one way or another, and I'm sort of glad I made that determination because I don't think I want to know what percentage of vote I received when I ran against Lee Dreyfus for governor. But no, that was a comfortable win in 70 for Pat Lucey, and it was even a more comfortable win in 1974.
Now, Pat Lucey is known for several very important policy changes: the merger of the university system, the exemption of manufacturing machinery and equipment from the property tax, which was a big boost for business at the time. Were you involved in those things directly?
Again, as a presiding officer of the Senate, I had an opportunity to participate in developing support for those pieces of legislation. And it was a tough role to hold because this was sort of counterintuitive that a Democrat governor would be in favor of bringing tax breaks to industry. And to think about merging the University of Wisconsin system, there were so many ingrained thoughts and ideals about how this university should operate, and a great competition as to how future campuses would be determined. So it was some heavy lifting, but pretty fortunate I felt to be involved in that.
Pat Lucy said, gave Lee Dreyfus some credit for the merger. At the time he was president of the UW Stevens Point, then part of the state system. Did you see that?
I didn't work at that legislation on that issue. My efforts were confined basically to working with various state senators to get a sense of what their inhibitions were, so to speak, about why they would or would not have wanted to support that, and then trying to develop the understanding and an argument of their arguments and being able to respond.
Obviously you prevailed to get the merger. Was it a good thing?
We hope so. You know, one of the unanswered questions is where would we be if that legislation would have failed? You know, would something have been able to grow and develop and to give birth to other things that would have been of a more significant nature of benefit? And as I sit here now, I think it's great that we don't have those competing systems. I think it's great that we have hopefully a united effort in front into identification of specific missions of each campus. And so one always hopes that when you are involved in major pieces of legislation that it turned out for the good.
Did you enjoy being lieutenant governor?
It was a gas. The idea of being directly involved in the legislative process, at the same time directly involved with the executive branch of government. Again, as I said, the governor gave me the leeway to get involved in any number of different issues. The idea of traveling the state to promote the administration positions, developing the friendships across the state. I don't think I would have ever been able to have those experiences without being a lieutenant governor.
Do you think it would be a good idea to have the lieutenant governor preside again then over the Senate, to have that linkage?
Probably not. I think the Senate has gotten used to the luxury of not having any outsider come and determine their process. And it may be a good idea to have the lieutenant governor do that, but I don't think the Senate would ever accept it.
Well, talk about the election of '78 then. Governor Lucy resigned to become ambassador to Mexico under the Carter administration. You became, at the time the title was acting governor.
Sure.
I know there was some controversy over that. Did you enjoy being governor for the, what, year or more that you were governor?
Yes. Well, there again I get back to prayer and wishing that I had prayed for four-year terms rather than just becoming governor. That whole race was centered around the return of the surplus, which Lee Dreyfus promoted, or keeping it for a rainy day. But Lee Dreyfus was just an outstanding candidate, and I would travel the state having public hearings and town hall hearings on what is a good use for the surplus. And maybe I would have attracted 20 to 25 community-minded citizens putting advice and their ideas forward on what should happen with that surplus. And I can recall, I don't remember the name of the community, but all of a sudden, you know, we're talking about this issue, some 25 people, and all of a sudden I hear a band playing, and you know, we're in the basement, and we look up over the windows, and there is this band and this bus and this red vest, and Lee Dreyfus coming to town, and he sparked the enthusiasm of the crowd, and it was a great campaign. Now, some people say that it was maybe one of a kind, and you know, we won't be able to see something like that again for a period of time, but he certainly was able to capture a serious-minded young governor like me sort of off guard with his energized campaign, and giving me a sense that in retrospect, it's not the fact that I lost the election. It was the fact that I failed to adequately convey the message of what I wanted to do. And I don't look back at putting the responsibility on anyone's shoulders other than my inability to communicate in the qualitative manner that he did.
Now, basically, he had the one issue, give back the surplus.
That's correct. And also he had a way of speaking, like calling the state of Wisconsin the 23rd Psalm state. And, you know, this kind of picturesque language which would capture the imagination of the people. And also, you know, he took on the Republican establishment, going back into the Republican primary and beat Bob Caston, who was the odds-on favorite to be the candidate against me back there in 1978. But he beat him.
He was quite a phenomenon, something you can hardly plan for. I mean, when you were praying to be governor, you could hardly have foreseen a phenomenon like Lee Dreyfus.
Well, that's a fact. And I tell you, after I lost that election, I went to work with Century Insurance Company. And I know that they played every bit of a role in helping him get elected, not as a corporation, but many of the executives there. And but I went to work there, and lo and behold, in a period of time, it happenstance that Lee Dreyfus became my boss over at Century Insurance. I thought, oh my gosh, it's Stevens Point, Wisconsin. They played a role in electing him, and now he's coming along. But he was gracious and supportive, and promoted and helped me in every way possible. So that was quite an experience to think about having to work for him, but ending up feeling that it was a break. It was a good break.
Well, now, one of his lines was fiscal brinksmanship. Give back the surplus to the people you stole it from. I remember that line very well from that campaign. And play fiscal brinksmanship, that is to say, kind of starve the state, the government for money, and then it won't be able to spend so much. Little did he know, perhaps, at the time, what fiscal brinksmanship would end up with in the state of Wisconsin.
Well, I had a sense of the importance of saving money for a rainy day, and why, with all of his apparent common sense, he didn't see the same way I did, or why did not the people of Wisconsin, with all their great intelligence, see, you know, saving money for a rainy day as important of an issue as I saw it to be. But you know, you go on from there, and gosh, since that time, I won't say, you know, you look at where we are today, there's been so much taking place in between time that I don't think I could blame him for our current, you know, billions of dollars deficits that we're facing as a state, nor would I choose to do so.
But we still face brinksmanship. It seems like every single state budget since has been on the brink.
Yeah, well, that's a fact. And, you know, some people may contend that physical brinkmanship comes into play when you are trying to be conservative in your spending, intelligent and restraining. There are others who contend that physical brinkmanship is to actually starve the government so that certain programs have to be eliminated and the government, in essence, shrinks.
That's clearly what the Reagan people...
Well, that's the Reagan people, and whether or not that's what is going on right now, you know, with the Republican Party and their spending of money and the inability to, you know, meet the payments, whether it's for the war or whether it's no tax increases or what have you. But it is a great challenge, and you know, for those of us who feel that government plays an important role there, the Republicans' current perceived attitude on physical brinkmanship does this country a great deal of harm.
They simply don't believe in government, apparently.
Some people, yeah. I guess, you know,
but you still do. I mean, this does not seem to be a popular thing to say right now as we speak, but well, government has things to do.
You know, it's sort of fun, not fun. It's intriguing to watch, for want of a better term, the Tea Party candidates say that government is too big. When the ash flies from a volcano and they can't get back from Europe, why doesn't government do something? When the sewers back up, why doesn't government do something? When the hurricanes come, why doesn't government do something? You know, we are at war with the Taliban. Why doesn't government do something? And so everyone has their own conception of government. And it seems that as long as government is doing something for somebody else that doesn't directly involve them, well, that's not good for government to do that. But when they themselves personally are affected, if you have children and they're going to the University of Wisconsin and so forth, well, I think it's a good idea that government do those kinds of things. And I said,
Did you know before Election Day that you were likely to lose in '78?
oh, I got the feeling. I had the ability of putting people to sleep during some of my speeches, and I think that it helped them health-wise to be able to get that catch up on sleep. But you do get a sense. It's a feeling. I can recall when Gaylord Nelson lost, and I can recall when Hubert Humphrey didn't win the presidential election, and it just seems that there's sort of an aura that surrounds a campaign where you can sense it, and I began to sense that this thing here was not going well. As a side note, Lee Dreyfus and I, our campaigns both spend about $800,000 to $900,000 each, for a total of what, $1.8 million. Now $1.8 million is nothing in a single campaign, and they're talking 4, 5, 8, 12, $15 million for a race for governor of Wisconsin. And you know, the question is, where has all the money gone? And that, I think, just heightens the challenge that we have as a people in a democracy to get the kind of legislation passed that is going to be untainted by special interests.
I covered the '78 election, and if you'll pardon me throwing in some opinions here, it seemed to me that you were less than confident in a big speaking situation, especially the debates with Dreyfus. I mean, he was so glib, such
Yes.
a natural public speaker. Because I'd see you in small groups, talking to a small group in their living room, and you were great. You can work a room, and you were great with that. But you seemed to lack confidence, maybe because of the contrast with Dreyfus on the platform. And those debates were so important in '78.
Well, I think you're right. I think you accurately reflected what was going on, and I do feel very comfortable in a setting such as this and meeting with a group of people, and maybe all the world is a stage, but I felt my stage was more working with people as individuals. And this is a side note on the debate. I can recall the debate in Stevens Point, and I don't know if you were there or not, but there was a group of people that, for want of a better term, called the Pickens people. Pickens had been arrested and put in jail for the rape of a Playboy bunny at Lake Geneva, and his followers wanted him out of jail, and they wanted him given consideration, and so they would show up, and these were former Playboy bunnies, and intriguing on how we get into this, but they were former Playboy bunnies, and they would come to these listening sessions that I would have, wired for sound and interested in getting me to say something which they could then in turn use against me, and of course that never happened. Now, we're at the debate in Stevens Point. I think it's the final debate, and the rules were that the camera would focus on the person making the presentation, and that was it. So I'm in my closing arguments, and here the Pickens people were in the front row, and while I am giving my closing argument, they charged the stage. Now, I remember this very well, and I stopped talking because it distracted, and also I was very concerned as to what was going on. Well, my wife was at home watching the debate, and she said, "What happened? All of a sudden you stopped talking." And it looked like, you know, I may have been young, but I appeared as a feeble-minded old man. And that may not have caused the election, but you know, you just never know what happens when you're involved in a political campaign and what happened in these debates. Well, finally they were wrestled to the ground, and everything was brought under control. I continued speaking. Well, by that time, you know, it's hard to form a good first-second impression.
Yeah, and people at home don't know what's happened. There's
They did
a
not
minute gone by or something, and it
That's
seems
correct.
like forever.
So now to everyone out there who would have voted for me, but for that, you know.
Well, so after 1978, you went to work for Century. Soon after?
Went to work for Century Insurance Company, and
Did they called you right after the election, or what?
well, that they called me and they said, you know, we want you to come and work with Century Insurance. And I said, well, I know that you played a role in defeating me. And I said, not only that, but I don't think I want to be in insurance. And I says, if I want to be in insurance, I know I don't want to be with Century. And he said, well, that's too bad, but we want to pay you $50,000 a year. I said, just a moment, I'll get Governor Schreiber to the phone. And so we moved there, and Elaine and I, with the family, established a hobby farm. And I always wanted to have a farm, and so that was a great experience, and worked with them, and then went on to become a publisher of a financial management journal for ranchers and farmers, which was an experience in traveling the country and talking about the farm credit system. And then the itch for public office, you know, it just never left. And I ran for governor in 1982 and lost in the primary to Tony Earl. And then in 1988, I ran for mayor of Milwaukee and lost that election. And there's an old saying, when three people tell you you're drunk, it's time to go to bed. And I concluded that that was the moment in time when I would head off in another direction. And at that point then, after 88, opened up a law practice because I wanted to become everyone's family attorney. And the polls told me that people had confidence in me and that they trusted me, and I thought, well, what better? And it didn't take me long to conclude that I was not cut out to sit behind a desk and to draft pleadings and so on. And then by the grace of God, someone needed help on a legislative matter. In fact, it was Miller Brewing Company. And then at that moment in time also, Schneider Communications out of Green Bay had a communications tax issue. And someone knew someone who recommended me, and that was the beginning of my career in public affairs as a public affairs counselor, as a lobbyist. And so that's been now almost 22 years, and it's been a great run. I can still be involved in government. I don't have to worry about newspaper editorial writers who don't know what they're talking about. I can be involved in issues that are going to be an important force in determining what may or may not be happening good in our government. So it's been an interesting number of years, going back to start off in government back in 1962.
But before we get into your lobbying career, I want to pick up one loose end. Lee Dreyfus, after he served as governor, became president. Was it president of Century Insurance?
That's correct, yes.
Which nobody thought was a good fit. But how did that work out?
Well, for me, it worked out great. Again, because he was gracious and friendly, and we never had animosity towards one another. In fact, his mother served on a youth commission when I was a senior in high school, and I would pick her up from her home, and after the meeting was over, I would take her home, and so there was a relationship, you know, between Lee Dreyfus and myself.
Well, let's talk about your career afterward as a lobbyist. Some people think that's a pejorative term. What does a lobbyist do?
Well, you know, pejorative term, let's deal with that for a moment. There's no question but that the perception is that it is the type of profession which does not lend itself well to being the highest calling. But by the same token, the question is, what does a lobbyist do? In essence, a translator. In essence, translating to a person or a business what government does and how it works, and then translating to the legislator from the business or the person what that business or person does that is going to be impacted upon by a decision in government. So, for example, I mentioned Miller Brewing Company, and there's a discussion about whether or not a distributor should or shouldn't be doing one thing or another. Or if we work with the Forest County Potawatomi, a discussion on whether there should or should not be a Clean Energy Job Act. And as you take a look at these issues, those people who work in business have their specialty and their own interests and ability, and government is alien. And as we talked about before, like watching sausage being made. And so somehow or another they've got to get a sense and an understanding of their ability to make an impact on the decision-making process. And so in essence, I'm an educator as well as a translator.
Now, you have quite a list of clients. You've mentioned Miller Brewing, your first client and one of your biggest, but you've had, the state troopers, and as you mentioned, the Potawatomi, the city of Madison, the Wisconsin Fraternal Congress, a couple of unions, quite a variety of entities that you've represented.
Well, my goal never was to be the biggest, but it was to be the best. And many of the clients that you mentioned have been with me for 22 years, for the full length of my business. And it's a matter of trying to make sure they understand, again, the impact they can have, and then also making sure that there is the quality relationship between the client and the legislative process as well as the legislature itself. And we take great pride not only in the integrity of our service, but in the integrity of the client, and also in making sure that legislators get a sense and an understanding of what the client's concerns and issues are as how they affect them.
Your website, I looked up your website, and not only lobbying, but grassroots organizing and media relations are mentioned. Do you understand what's happening to the media? I don't.
No, I don't understand what is happening to the media, but I think I have a sense of what drives it. And you know, you and I, if we go back to when you first started covering the state capitol, most of the news came through the newspaper. We've seen what's happened to the newspaper circulation. It used to be the newspapers were the eyes and ears and the watchdog, and they no longer had the advertising revenue to be that watchdog. And so it could be that to a certain degree there is no one minding the store from the standpoint of making sure that there is the attention and the focus on state government. I think at one point or another there could have been 7 Milwaukee Journal reporters covering Madison, Wisconsin. I don't know, maybe there are 2 or 3, and almost impossible to do that job. But then also we have the heightened the heightened political atmosphere in which the Fox News of the world is using, in my opinion, using the politics as a money-making proposition. But also, I think one of the great disasters to our democracy is the 24-hour news show, where there always has to be something going on to keep the viewer's attention. And if during this interview I might cough and make an aside, well, all of a sudden that becomes news, and they have to ask the other side what they think about my cough. And of course, a bad analogy, but the fact of the matter is the 24-hour news cycle continues to have to stir up news and interest, so that there's a continuous watching of that, and the hyperbole and the name calling and so forth, I think, becomes so heightened that it really destroys the ability of people to communicate in a meaningful manner, because it's like watching a football game, and every play that happens is looked at as being a world-changing event, when it's not. It's one process or one part of it, and it seems that the 24-hour news process never gives anybody a chance to be judged by the whole context of what they're trying to do, but just individual specs of the process and trying to get there. And therein lies the challenge. So I figured it all out for you.
Yeah. Well, cynical people say that in Washington it's money. The lobbyist goes in and says, you know, vote this way or we'll finance your opponent. That this is what it's come down to. Is that the way it is in Madison? Does it ever happen that way?
Oh, I think it's happened that way from the beginning of humankind, where people have, you know, said, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to switch my allegiance, or cause you in some way to feel the results of my frustration or anger with you at the polls. I mentioned before that when Lee Dreyfus and I ran, it was roughly $800,000 to $900,000 per candidate, and now it's in the millions. And also, there had never been the degree of reliance upon anyone to keep their job. In other words, people, I believe, were more interested in the direction of the nation rather than in the direction of their own special career. And when you focus on the career, that money becomes so important to maintain yourself in public office. So in answer to your question, does money many times drive the decision-making process? Yes, it does. And is it good for our country? I believe no, it is not. And of salute to Russ Feingold and others who are trying to take the money out of the system. You know, they've tried, and it hasn't been very successful.
That was my next question. How do we de-escalate from this point?
Oh, I tell you, this is not a direct answer. People look at negative campaign ads and they say, we don't like it, and it's in bad taste. But yet the studies that have been done prove that negative campaign ads work. And so I was going to say, how do we get to the bottom of this? You know, probably through hoping people understand that they've got to make judgments not on how many ads they see, but really more on the person's temperament and character. And how do you get that across? I don't know. You know, I don't know if I have an answer to the question as to how we develop some saneness and sensibility into the equation. They've been having a problem, you know, passing these laws and then having the Supreme Court feel that, you know, freedom of speech trumps whatever kinds of restrictions people might want to try and place on corporations or individuals from putting in large amounts of money into the campaign. And it's a tough challenge.
But as far as your own career as a lobbyist concerned, you're proud of it?
Yes, I'm very proud. And when I tell my grandchildren what I do, I used to feel that I would tell them that I was involved in government affairs and not involved as a lobbyist, but now I have no problem at all telling them that I am a lobbyist. And as I look back, we've been able to help out a lot of people, and we've been able to have an impact on making certain situations safer and to allow more people to have opportunity, and for that I'm very proud.
To end this on an upbeat note, you have 4 partners, not a small operation here, and you have young people as interns. What's your experience with them?
Well, the young people are smarter and brighter than I ever thought we would have young people be. And they are students at the University of Wisconsin for the most part, and have proven themselves to be so bright and so intelligent and resourceful that sometimes, you know, we look at the high cost of campaigns and we look at the challenges that we face, but then we see these bright young people come along, and it gives us an opportunity for greater hope and to not be so discouraged as to the course that we're on, because there are some good people coming up that are going to help change the system for the better.
And your advice to a young person then, if they want to go into something political?
Oh, go for it. Are you kidding? How are you, what is the best way of changing, you know, that which you feel should be changed? Unless you have an ability to write, or unless you have an ability to speak, or unless you have an ability to do something of a very special nature, I don't know of any greater opportunity for public service than to serve in public life, and to understand that by, you know, working with people of the same concerns, there can be a change and there can be a difference.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Enjoyed it a lot.